With the death of Hamas Chief Yahya Sinwar, he's been effectively neutralized by Israeli forces just yesterday evening. A confirmation about that coming late Indian time in the night. We have with us Jonathan Conricus, who's a former IDF spokesperson, also a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thanks so much, Jonathan, for joining us. Let me begin by asking you that the neutralization of the Hamas chief yesterday, would you say that the Hamas has now been effectively rendered inept?
Yes, good evening, and thank you for having me on your show. A pleasure as always, especially when we finally have something positive to speak about. Unfortunately, no, I wouldn't say that Hamas is done as a military organization or as a political organization. Hamas has indeed sustained a heavy blow. They are now disorganized, and there's perhaps a lot of confusion and inability temporarily to act against Israel. But unfortunately, we cannot, with this action alone, defeat Hamas, and there is still more action needed. However, there is a window of opportunity for the remaining Hamas leaders to actually surrender, call a ceasefire, and return the Israeli hostages. If they decide to do so, then the war could end, and all the suffering could be ended for Israelis and for Gazans.
Right. And also, as someone who's been privy to operations of this nature in the past, what can you tell us about the kind of strategy and planning that could have led to a successful execution this time?
Well, you know, Israel over the last year or so has been very successful in eliminating heads of terror organizations. It's a long list of Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Iranian terrorists that Israel has successfully eliminated, most of those using special forces and very high level and high resolution of intelligence. That was not the case this time. This time, I'll be honest and say that we caught a lucky break, and that these were ordinary IDF ground units, infantry and armor, who were out conducting a basic patrol in the southern Gaza city of Rafah. They encountered 3 enemy combatants. They engaged them in combat with the main battle tank that struck the house, and then the infantry soldiers went in to search, and they were surprised to find no one else but the mastermind of the October 7 massacre against Israel, and the man who almost single-handedly killed more Jews since the Holocaust than any other person.
Right. And was this a joint operation with the United States? Because the statement that came from the President of the United States seems to suggest that there's been a lot of coordination, a lot of intelligence sharing that's been on for some time now, along with Israel.
Well, there's definitely very deep and intimate coordination between the U.S. armed forces in the region under the command of General Kurilla, Central Command, and the IDF. It's been going on throughout, of course, at the political level as well, and that is for all purposes, defensive and offensive, defending Israel against Iranian attacks and helping Israel, of course, to replenish its stockpiles and to engage its enemies. However, this specific successful elimination of Yahya Sinwar was a very local tactical event, not planned or executed together with anybody else. But I would say that, of course, continued pressure, intelligence and otherwise operational pressure that the IDF has been applying on Gaza and in hunting for Yahya Sinwar for sure contributed. But the specific elimination of Sinwar was done by ordinary ground troops and quite random activity, not together with the U.S.
Right. Also, what does this really mean for the 101 Israeli hostages and nationals of other countries in Gaza? When can we expect them to be home safe? Because this is one of the things that Israel has always spoken about when we talk about, when will the war come to an end? So what implications does this have for the hostages?
So this can go in one of 2 ways. One way is that the remaining leaders of Hamas will take the proposal offered by Prime Minister Netanyahu and actually decide to surrender and hand over the hostages. And by doing so, they would be saving themselves and they would be saving Gaza from continued fighting. That's one option. The second option is that Hamas takes punitive measures against our hostages. And of course, we hope that this doesn't happen, but there is a risk that Hamas will escalate the situation by executing the remaining Israeli hostages. And I'll remind everybody watching, we have 101 Israeli hostages, most of them civilians who have been in Hamas captivity for over 1 year, including 2 babies, one of them who has spent more time in Hamas dungeons than he has spent outside of them. He was abducted when he was 5 months old, and he's now almost a year and a half old.
Right. And what do you think are the implications for the broader conflict with Iran and its proxies like Hezbollah?
Well, yesterday was not a good day for Iran and its empire of evil. It was not a good day for Hezbollah either. And I think it was a good day for any freedom-loving fighters against terrorism. Any democracy that fights against terrorists, whether it is in Western Asia or in other countries. I think that what we will see in the coming days will be a significant Israeli strike against Iran in retaliation for the last Iranian attack on Israel, the second Iranian attack on Israel. And I hope not to be mistaken, but I think that we will be looking at a new chapter in the history of Western Asia, where Israel perhaps finally will change its strategy towards Iran and no longer allow Iran to attack Israel through its proxies without facing any consequences, but actually holding the Iranians responsible for their activities and making the Iranian regime, not the people, but the Iranian regime, pay a price for their aggression.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned Iran, because what Iran has been saying, and I'm quoting what the Iranian mission to the UN has said in its statement posted on social media X, is that when Muslims look up to Martyr Sinwar standing on the battlefield in combat attire and out in the open, not in a hideout facing the enemy, the spirit of resistance will be strengthened. He will become a model for youth and children who will carry forward his part towards the liberation of Palestine. So are you then expecting an Iranian offensive similar to the response after Nasrallah's elimination?
You know, regarding the Iranians, soon they'll be running out of Arabs to do their fighting for them. And they've sent forward Gazans, Lebanese, Syrians, Iraqis, Yemenites. I wonder when the Arabs will wake up and understand that they're being used by the cynical and cowardly Iranian regime. And I don't think that the Iranians will be putting out a lot of statements after Israel engages them directly, which Israel will. And I think that they'll be singing a different tune. They may, have propaganda messages of bravado and calls of battle. That is not what we see happening on the ground. We see the Iranians now beginning to understand that the whole strategy of attacking Israel and that is now bringing the war back to them, which I'm not sure they were prepared for, and I think that they are quite concerned with. Right. But I won't say too much about it. We'll have to wait and see the coming week where this takes us. I don't think that the Iranians will be talking too much in a week or so.
All right. And also about the drone video that was shot, released by the IDF of Yahya Sinwar's last moments. Somewhere do you think that perhaps strategically or tactically this was a mistake in releasing this particular footage? And the reason I'm saying is that there are many who've come out to say that this video has in a way practically eulogized Sinwar, because there are those who are talking about him being martyred, as him being a quote-unquote resistance fighter, so on and so forth. The others who are saying that this is an image that will inspire us for centuries. What do you make of these arguments and comments?
People can be inspired by whatever they want. And I think that people that espouse the extremist ideology of extremist Islam, I don't think that they need special reasons. They can take things out of their imagination. They can be inspired by misinterpreting the Holy Quran, and they can be inspired by perceived injustices or whatever. There's really no stop to it. What I know is that Yahya Sinwar spent most, if not all, of his last year hiding in tunnels like a coward. He was not out on the battlefield. He was sending poor Gazans to fight for him. He is the one who has brought catastrophe to the people of Gaza. He is the one who has brought ruin and destruction on Gaza. And if I were an Arab and if I were a Palestinian, I would look at that and understand that those are the consequences for opening war against Israel. If you attack Israel, if you perform the acts of barbarism that Yahya Sinwar and his Hamas terrorists did, then the consequences that you bring upon yourself, your organization, and the civilian surroundings that where you hide, they are dire consequences. And I think anybody now looking at Gaza and southern Lebanon for that stake as well can understand that attacking Israel and performing this heinous gruesome attacks of Israeli civilians is a terrible mistake, should not be repeated by anybody.
Right. There are also reports coming in of protests by civilians in Jordan. There are, of course, similarly, the similar sort of comments coming in that Hamas will stay strong with or without Sinwar. So do you look at this kind of protest? Are you taking it very seriously, what's happening in the neighborhood of Israel?
Yes, we are. Jordan is an important country, and they have a large and restive Palestinian population, which is causing a lot of trouble and instability. The Jordanian kingdom, the Hashemite kingdom, does a lot to stabilize the situation. But at the end of the day, lots of Palestinians generally means lots of trouble. And that is an issue that we're monitoring. We have good ties with the Jordanians. We have shared strategic interests, and we are watching very closely. Of course, this is also related to the Iranians. The Iranians, wherever they see signs of instability, they move in order to exasperate them and to make suffering worse in order to provide for their own interests, for the Iranian interests. And we see Iranian fingerprints all over, and we're monitoring what they do. And I think that will be something that Israel takes into consideration when Israel strikes Iran as well.
Right. You, of course, spoke of the different possibilities of various peace deals, etc., and what all is on the table. But what is your realistic assessment in terms of the war ending now? There is a lot of international pressure also building up, saying now is perhaps a time to de-escalate. It's perhaps a time for ceasefire.
Yeah, we'll have to distinguish here between the war against Hamas in Gaza and the other active fronts. Regarding Gaza, I think that it's very clear what Israel wants. If Israel could wrap this up, get our hostages home, and deny Hamas the ability to regroup and continue to control the Gaza Strip, then Israel would do that. And Israel has indeed offered the remaining leaders of Hamas to do exactly that. With an intention of ending the fighting, ending suffering, turning the page, and starting to rebuild southern Israel and rebuild Gaza. If Hamas takes that offer, then that will be a very good step forward, and that will be great for civilians on both sides of the border. The other areas where Israel is being attacked from, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and first and foremost Iran, there is still lots of unfinished business there, and I think that since they opened and they started these aggressions against Israel, Israel is obliged to defend itself and make sure that our enemies won't be able to continue to attack us, to safeguard Israeli civilians. So I do not see a swift end to the fighting against Hezbollah or the Iranians. There is still a lot of work to be done.
Right. Israel has also been under criticism over the past several months for the airstrikes that have resulted in over 40,000 casualties, including that of civilians. And as per estimates by the Lebanese government, at least 1.2 million people have been displaced due to the same. Now, the big question is that, with this kind of deaths, this kind of figures that we're talking about, at the end of the day, will Israel have to take the responsibility and now at least scale back, given the kind of events that we've seen take place over the last few days?
Yeah, the world is usually very quick to criticize Israel. In my opinion, not that Israel should be above criticism, but I think that Israel is singled out unfairly, held to, frankly, impossible standards when it comes to fighting. And I would remind anybody criticizing Israel that A, we did not start this war and we didn't want it. B, the enemy, Hamas and Hezbollah, are the ones that are fighting from within densely populated urban terrain. They are the ones who are using human shields. The IDF doesn't want to fight in urban terrain. It's the worst possible place to fight. And if we had an option to fight them out in the open desert, believe me, we would take it. But we are forced to fight where our enemies are. And C, Israel has taken tremendous cautionary measures in order to minimize the toll and effect on civilian population. Sadly, there are still civilians killed, but that is not because of the IDF's tactics or procedures. It is because our enemies are using civilians as human shields. And those that should be criticized are Hamas, are Hezbollah, the state of Lebanon that enables it, and anybody else that uses civilians in such a cowardly way.
Right. And my last question to you, how would you respond to those who say that been fairly successful over the last year in eliminating the leadership of Hamas and Hezbollah? There perhaps would be others who would be willing to take their place.
If there will be others, we will fight them until we defeat them as well.
All right, Jonathan, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us and sharing with us so frankly what really has been transpiring. And thank you so much for joining us this evening, even despite the fact that it's a festival day there in Israel.
Thank you.